Marco Santelli looked at his watch. It was almost midnight. The last people had left the Milano Opera House 2 hours ago. Now it was his turn to work. He picked up his mop and bucket from the storage room. His blue uniform had his name written on it. The letters were faded now. He had worn the same uniform for 3 years. The opera house was quiet now. During the day, it was full of music and voices. People in beautiful clothes came to watch shows. They paid lots of money for their tickets. They sat in red velvet seats and clapped when the music ended. But Marco never sat in those seats. He only cleaned them. Marco walked into the main hall. The ceiling was very high. Big lights hung down like stars. The walls had gold paint on them. Everything looked expensive. Marco had seen this room thousands of times, but it still made him feel small. He was just the cleaning man. Nobody really saw him. He started with the seats. Row by row, he wiped each one. Red velvet felt soft under his cloth. Sometimes he found things people had dropped. A pearl earring, a silk glove, a program from the show. He always put these things in the lost and found box. Maybe someone would come back for them. As Marco worked, he thought about the music he had heard earlier. The opera singers had been practicing. Their voices went through the thin walls of his storage room. He knew all the songs now. He had heard them so many times. Sometimes he sang along quietly while he worked, but only when nobody was around. Marco had not always been a cleaner. When he was young, he had big dreams. His mother had saved money to buy him piano lessons. Every week he walked 2 miles to his teacher's house. Mrs. Rosa was old and kind. She taught him how to put his fingers on the keys. She showed him how to read music. She said he had natural talent. For 10 years, Marco learned to play piano. He practiced every day after school. His family was poor, but they had an old piano in their living room. The keys were yellow and some did not work well, but Marco loved that piano. He played it until his fingers hurt. When Marco was 18, he wanted to go to music school. He had big dreams of playing in concert halls. He wanted to wear a black suit and bow tie. He wanted people to clap for his music, but music school cost too much money. His family could not pay for it, so Marco had to find a job instead. At first, Marco worked in a factory. He made car parts all day. The work was hard and boring. The machines were loud. He could not hear music over the noise. After work, he was too tired to play piano. Slowly, his dreams started to fade away. Then Marco's father got sick. The medicine cost a lot of money. Marco had to find a better job. That was when he saw the ad for the opera house. They needed someone to clean at night. The pay was better than the factory. Marco took the job right away. On his first night at the opera house, Marco felt strange. He was back in a place with music, but now he was not there to play or listen. He was there to clean up after other people. It made him feel sad and happy at the same time. The other workers at the opera house were nice to Marco. There was Giuseppe, who took care of the lights. There was Anna, who sewed the costumes. There was Roberto, who moved the heavy things on stage. They all worked at night like Marco. They became his friends. But none of them knew about Marco's secret. None of them knew he could play piano. Marco never told anyone. What was the point? He was just a cleaner now. His dreams were in the past. Sometimes when Marco finished his work early, he would sit in the empty theater. He would look at the big black piano on the stage. It was beautiful and shiny. He wondered what it would feel like to play it. But he never went up there. That stage was not for people like him. The piano on the stage was very expensive. Marco had read about it in a newspaper. It was made by a famous company. Only the best musicians got to play it. Marco had seen them during rehearsals. They wore nice clothes and had soft hands. They were nothing like him. Marco's hands were rough now. Years of cleaning had made them hard. His fingernails were always dirty, no matter how much he washed them. Sometimes he looked at his hands and felt sad. These were not the hands of a piano player anymore. But late at night, when nobody was around, Marco would sometimes touch the piano keys, just for a second, just to remember what it felt like. The keys were smooth and cold. They reminded him of his old piano at home. That piano was gone now. His family had sold it when his father got sick. Marco lived alone in a small apartment near the opera house. He had no wife or children. Music had been his only love. But now he just listened to it through walls while he worked. He had a small radio in his room. He played classical music on it every night before he went to sleep. Every morning, Marco woke up and put on his blue uniform. He looked in the mirror and saw a tired man with sad eyes. This was his life now. Clean the seats, mop the floors, empty the trash, go home, sleep, start again. But deep inside, Marco still loved music. He could not help it. When he heard a beautiful song, his heart still moved. When he saw people playing piano, he still felt jealous. The music was still inside him, even if nobody knew it. Sometimes Marco wondered what would happen if he told someone about his piano skills. Would they laugh at him? Would they think he was crazy? A cleaner who thought he could play classical music? It seemed impossible. So Marco kept his secret. Every night he cleaned the opera house. Every night he listened to the music through the walls. Every night he looked at the piano on the stage and remembered his old dreams. But he never did anything about it. He was just Marco the cleaner. That was all he would ever be, or so he thought. February 15th was the most important night of the year at the Milano Opera House. The annual gala was happening. Rich people from all over the city had bought tickets. Some tickets cost more than Marco made in a month. Everyone was dressed in their finest clothes. Women wore diamonds and long dresses. Men wore expensive suits. Marco arrived at work earlier than usual. There was more to clean before the big show. The opera house had to look perfect. Every seat had to shine. Every floor had to be spotless. The bathrooms needed extra soap and towels. Everything had to be ready. The star of tonight's show was Alessandro Moretti. He was a famous piano player from Rome. People traveled from other countries just to hear him play. Tonight, he would perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It was one of the hardest pieces of music ever written. Only the best piano players could play it well. Marco knew this piece very well. He had heard it many times on his radio. He had even tried to play parts of it on his old piano, back when he was young. It was beautiful, but very difficult. The piano player had to be very skilled to make it sound right. All day, people were getting ready for the gala. Flowers were delivered to the lobby. The red carpet was rolled out. Camera crews came to film the famous people arriving. The kitchen staff prepared fancy food for the reception after the show. Marco watched all this activity while he worked. He saw how excited everyone was. This was a big deal for the opera house. Many important people would be there. Music critics from newspapers would write reviews. If the show went well, it would be good for everyone who worked there. At 4 o'clock, Alessandro Moretti arrived for his sound check. Marco was cleaning near the stage when the famous pianist walked in. Moretti was a tall man with gray hair. He wore an expensive coat and shiny shoes. He looked like what Marco imagined a real musician should look like. Moretti sat at the piano and started to play. The music filled the empty theater. It was beautiful. Marco stopped cleaning and listened. The way Moretti played was amazing. His fingers moved so fast they looked like a blur. The music seemed to dance in the air. After the sound check, Moretti went to his dressing room to rest before the show. Marco continued his work. He cleaned the stage extra carefully. He wanted everything to be perfect for the performance. Even though he was just the cleaner, he felt proud to be part of this special night. At 6 o'clock, the first guests started to arrive. Marco watched them from the second-floor window. Expensive cars dropped off well-dressed people. They walked on the red carpet and smiled for the cameras. Marco had never seen so many diamonds and fancy clothes in one place. The lobby filled up quickly. People drank champagne and talked loudly. Marco could hear them laughing and chatting as he worked upstairs. Soon it would be time for the show to start. Everyone would go to their seats. The lights would go down. The music would begin. Marco was mopping the hallway near the dressing rooms when he heard shouting. It was coming from Moretti's dressing room. The door was open a little bit. Marco could see inside. The famous pianist was bent over a trash can. He looked very sick. A doctor was with him. So was Signora Benedetti, the opera house director. She was a small woman with white hair. She always wore black dresses and looked very serious. Tonight, she looked scared. "How bad is it?" Signora Benedetti asked the doctor. "Food poisoning," the doctor said. "It's severe. He needs to go to the hospital right away. He cannot perform tonight." Moretti tried to speak but could only make sick sounds. His face was green. Sweat covered his forehead. He could barely stand up. "This cannot be happening," Signora Benedetti said. "Not tonight. We have 800 people out there. The mayor is here. The music critics are here. We cannot cancel this show." The doctor shook his head. "I'm sorry, but there's no choice. This man cannot play piano tonight. He can barely walk." Marco kept mopping, but he was listening to every word. He felt sorry for Moretti. Food poisoning was terrible. But he also felt sorry for Signora Benedetti. This was a disaster for the opera house. An ambulance came for Moretti. The paramedics put him on a stretcher and took him away. Signora Benedetti stood in the empty dressing room looking lost. Her assistant, a young woman named Clara, was trying to think of solutions. "Can we get another piano player?" Clara asked. "At this hour? On such short notice? For Rachmaninoff?" Signora Benedetti shook her head. "It's impossible. The few musicians who could play this piece are either out of the country or have other concerts tonight. What about postponing the show?" "We cannot. People have traveled from other cities. Some came from other countries. The newspaper critics are here. If we cancel now, it will ruin our reputation." Marco finished mopping and moved to clean the next hallway. But he could still hear them talking. They were getting more desperate. Someone suggested playing recorded music instead of live piano. Someone else suggested having just the orchestra play without the piano. All the ideas sounded bad. The show was supposed to start in 1 hour. In the lobby, 800 people were eating appetizers and drinking wine. They had no idea what was happening backstage. They were expecting to hear one of the world's greatest piano pieces played by one of the world's best pianists. Instead, they might get nothing. Marco thought about the piece Moretti was supposed to play. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. He knew it so well. He had listened to it hundreds of times. He had even played parts of it long ago on his old piano. Of course, he had never played it with an orchestra. He had never played it for an audience. But he knew the music. As Marco worked, an crazy idea started to form in his mind. What if he could help? What if he could play the piece? It was a wild thought. He was just a cleaner. Nobody would take him seriously. But what if? Marco tried to push the idea away. It was stupid. He had not played piano seriously in years. His hands were rough from cleaning. He had no formal training in classical performance. He would embarrass himself and ruin the show, but the idea would not go away. As he cleaned the stairs, he thought about the music. As he emptied the trash cans, he remembered how the piece sounded. As he wiped down the mirrors, he imagined himself at the piano. The time for the show was getting closer. In 30 minutes, people would go to their seats. The orchestra was already warming up. Marco could hear them tuning their instruments. But there was still no piano player. Marco finished his cleaning duties early. He put his supplies away and walked toward the stage area. He could see Signora Benedetti and Clara still trying to solve their problem. They were making phone calls and looking more worried every minute. Marco stood there for a long time, watching them. His heart was beating fast. His mouth felt dry. He was thinking about something that seemed impossible. But maybe, just maybe, it was not impossible. Maybe this was his chance. Marco took a deep breath. His whole life was about to change. He just did not know it yet. All he knew was that 800 people were waiting for music and he might be the only one who could give it to them. The question was, did he have the courage to try? Marco stood in the hallway watching Signora Benedetti pace back and forth. Her phone was pressed to her ear. She was calling every musician she knew, but each call ended the same way. "No, they cannot come tonight. Sorry, they are not available." That piece is too difficult on short notice. Clara was at her laptop, searching online for any piano player in the city. She was getting desperate. The show had to start in 20 minutes. The guests were finishing their drinks in the lobby. Soon, they would want to go to their seats. Marco's hands were shaking. The crazy idea in his head was getting stronger. He knew he could play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. He had played it many times, piece by piece, on his old piano at home. Not perfectly, but he knew it. The question was, should he say something? What was the worst that could happen? They would say no. They would laugh at him, they might even fire him. But the show would still be ruined. At least if he tried, there was a small chance he could help. Marco took a step forward. Then he stopped. His heart was beating so fast he could hear it in his ears. This was crazy. He was a janitor. He cleaned toilets and mopped floors. He had not performed music for anyone in 15 years. What made him think he could play at the Milano Opera House? But then Marco thought about his mother. She had saved money from her job at the grocery store to pay for his piano lessons. She had believed in him. She had always said he was special. "Marco," she used to say, "God gave you a gift. Someday you will share it with the world." His mother had died 5 years ago. She never got to see him play in a real concert hall. But maybe tonight she would be watching from heaven. Marco looked at Signora Benedetti again. She had hung up her phone and was holding her head in her hands. Clara was crying quietly at her laptop. They had run out of options. The show would have to be canceled. 800 people would go home disappointed. The opera house would lose money and reputation. Marco made his decision. He walked slowly toward Signora Benedetti. His legs felt like they were made of water. Each step was difficult, but he kept walking. "Excuse me, Signora," Marco said quietly. Signora Benedetti looked up. She seemed surprised to see him. "Marco, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be working?" "I finished my work early tonight," Marco said. His voice was shaking. "I heard about the problem with Signor Moretti." "Yes, it's terrible," Signora Benedetti said. "We will have to cancel the show. There's no pianist available who knows the Rachmaninoff piece." Marco took a deep breath. This was it. The moment that would change everything. "Signora," he said, "I know the piece." Signora Benedetti stared at him. Clara looked up from her laptop. For a moment nobody spoke. "What did you say?" Signora Benedetti asked. "Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, Marco said. "I know it. I can play it." Signora Benedetti and Clara looked at each other. Then they looked back at Marco. They seemed confused. "Marco," Signora Benedetti said slowly, "you are our janitor." "Yes, I know," Marco said, "but I also play piano. I have been playing since I was 8 years old. I know the Rachmaninoff piece very well." Clara spoke for the first time. "Have you ever performed with an orchestra?" Marco's heart sank. "No," he admitted. "But I know the piece. I have played it many times by myself." Signora Benedetti shook her head. "Marco, this is very kind of you to offer, but this is Rachmaninoff. It's one of the most difficult pieces in classical music. Professional pianists study for years just to learn it. And you have never performed with an orchestra?" "No," Marco said. "But Signora, what choice do you have? You said yourself there is no one else available. If I fail, you are no worse off than you are now. But if I succeed..." But Marco did not finish the sentence. He did not want to sound too confident. The truth was he was terrified. But he was also excited. This might be his only chance to play real music again. Signora Benedetti was quiet for a long time. She was thinking. Marco could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was weighing the risks. A janitor playing Rachmaninoff at the most important show of the year. It sounded crazy, but what other option did she have? "Have you been drinking tonight?" she asked suddenly. "No, Signora," Marco said. "I never drink when I work." "Are you on any medication? Anything that might affect your judgment?" "No, Signora. Clara was looking at Marco with new eyes. "How long have you been playing piano?" she asked. 22 years, Marco said. "I started when I was 8. I played until I was 23. Then I stopped for practical reasons. But I still listen to classical music every day. I still know the pieces." "Why didn't you ever tell us you played piano?" Signora Benedetti asked. Marco felt embarrassed. "Who would care? I am just the janitor. Nobody asks janitors about their hobbies." Signora Benedetti looked at her watch. 15 minutes until the show was supposed to start. She looked at Clara, who shrugged. Then she looked back at Marco. "This is insane," she said. "If this goes badly, it will ruin the opera house's reputation. It might ruin my career." "I understand," Marco said. "But if you do nothing, the result will be the same." Signora Benedetti closed her eyes and rubbed her temples. Marco waited. His whole life was hanging in the balance. Either she would give him a chance or she would send him back to his mop and bucket. Finally, Signora Benedetti opened her eyes. "You have 15 minutes to prove yourself," she said. "Go to the piano. Play something from the Rachmaninoff. If you can convince me you know what you are doing, we will try it. If not, we cancel the show." Marco's heart jumped. "Thank you, Signora. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "This might be the stupidest decision I have ever made." Marco walked toward the stage. His legs were shaking so much he could barely walk. Behind him, he heard Signora Benedetti talking to Clara in a worried voice. "Call the conductor," she said. "Tell him we might have a replacement pianist. Tell him to be ready for anything." As Marco walked onto the stage, he saw the beautiful black piano waiting for him. It was the same piano he had looked at every night for 3 years, the same piano he had dreamed of playing. Now, finally, he would get his chance. But first, he had to prove himself to Signora Benedetti. He had 15 minutes to show her that a janitor could play like a professional musician. 15 minutes to make his mother's dreams come true. 15 minutes to change his life forever. Marco sat down at the piano bench. The keys looked so clean and white. He put his rough, cleaning-stained hands on them. They felt cold and smooth, just like he remembered. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Somewhere in the lobby, 800 people were waiting for music. In a few minutes, they would either hear one of the most beautiful pieces ever written, or they would go home, disappointed. It all depended on what happened in the next 15 minutes. Marco opened his eyes. It was time to play. Marco placed his hands on the piano keys. They felt cold against his skin. His hands were shaking slightly. He could feel Signora Benedetti watching him from the side of the stage. Clara was there too, along with the conductor who had just arrived. They all looked nervous. Marco closed his eyes and tried to remember his first piano lesson with Mrs. Rosa. She had taught him to breathe before he played. "Music comes from the heart," she used to say. "Let your heart speak through your fingers." He opened his eyes and began to play the opening of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The first notes were soft and gentle. They filled the empty theater like whispered secrets. Marco's fingers remembered exactly where to go. It was like riding a bicycle after many years. His body remembered what his mind had stored away. As he played, something magical happened. The rough, cleaning-stained hands that had mopped floors and scrubbed toilets began to dance across the keys like they belonged there. Years of hidden practice. Years of listening through walls, years of dreaming. It all came together in this moment. The music grew stronger and more confident. Marco could feel his nervousness melting away. This was what he was meant to do. This was who he really was underneath the janitor's uniform. He was Marco the musician, not Marco the cleaner. Signora Benedetti's mouth fell open. She had expected amateur playing, maybe a few simple melodies. She had not expected this. The janitor was playing like a professional. His technique was clean and precise. His interpretation was emotional and mature. This was not the playing of someone who had just learned the piece. This was the playing of someone who truly understood the music. The conductor, Maestro Giovanni, was equally amazed. He had worked with many pianists over the years. He knew good playing when he heard it. This janitor, this man they had all ignored for 3 years, was playing at a professional level. Marco continued playing, moving into the more difficult parts of the concerto. His fingers flew across the keys in rapid passages. The music soared and danced and cried. Each note was perfect. Each phrase told a story. This was not just piano playing. This was art. Clara was recording everything on her phone. She could not believe what she was seeing. In all her years working at the opera house, she had never witnessed anything like this. A janitor who could play Rachmaninoff. It seemed impossible, but it was happening right in front of her. After 10 minutes, Marco finished the section he was playing. The last notes faded into silence. He looked up at Signora Benedetti, waiting for her judgment. His heart was pounding, but not from fear anymore. It was pounding from excitement. He had remembered how much he loved music. He had remembered who he really was. Signora Benedetti walked slowly onto the stage. She was staring at Marco like she was seeing him for the first time. Which, in a way, she was. "Marco," she said quietly, "how long have you been able to play? Like this?" "Always," Marco said. "I mean, since I was young. I just never had a chance to show anyone." "Why did you stop playing professionally?" Marco looked down at his hands. "My family needed money. Music school was too expensive. I had to work instead." Signora Benedetti nodded. She understood. Many talented people never got the chance to pursue their dreams because of money. But she had never imagined that one of those people was working, right under her nose. "The orchestra will be here in 5 minutes," Maestro Giovanni said. "We need to make a decision." Signora Benedetti looked at her watch. The show was supposed to start in 10 minutes. In the lobby, 800 people were finishing their champagne and getting ready to take their seats. Some of the most important people in the city were out there. Music critics from major newspapers, wealthy donors who supported the opera house, the mayor and his wife. If Marco failed, it would be a disaster. But if he succeeded, it would be a miracle. "Do you think you can do this?" Signora Benedetti asked Marco. "Can you play the entire concerto with the orchestra, in front of 800 people, people who have paid a lot of money to hear professional music?" Marco thought about his mother. He thought about all the nights he had listened to music through the walls while he cleaned. He thought about the dreams he had put away when life became difficult. This was his chance, maybe his only chance. "Yes," he said. "I can do it." Signora Benedetti made her decision. "Then we are going to try something that has never been done before in the history of this opera house. Our janitor is going to perform as our featured pianist." Clara gasped. Maestro Giovanni looked shocked, but Marco just smiled. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive. "What should we tell the audience?" Clara asked. "How do we explain that our janitor is suddenly the star of the show?" "We tell them the truth," Signora Benedetti said. "Sometimes the most amazing surprises come from the most unexpected places." The orchestra members began arriving on stage. They were confused when they saw Marco sitting at the piano in his janitor's uniform. Maestro Giovanni quickly explained the situation. Some of the musicians looked skeptical, others seemed curious. But they were all professional. They would do their job regardless of who was playing piano. Marco looked out at the empty seats. In a few minutes, those seats would be full of people. Rich people, important people, people who expected the best, and he, a simple janitor, would be performing for them. But Marco was not thinking about being nervous anymore. He was thinking about the music. He was thinking about Rachmaninoff, who had written this beautiful piece over 100 years ago. He was thinking about all the great pianists who had played it before him. Tonight he would join that tradition. Tonight he would be part of something bigger than himself. The stage manager appeared. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the orchestra, "we have 5 minutes until curtain. Please take your positions." The musicians arranged themselves on stage. The violinists tuned their instruments one last time. The horn players warmed up with quiet scales. The timpani player adjusted his drums. Marco remained at the piano. He looked down at his janitor's uniform. For a moment, he felt out of place. Everyone else on stage was wearing black concert clothes. He was wearing work clothes with cleaning stains on them. But then Marco remembered something Mrs. Rosa had told him long ago. "The music does not care what you wear," she had said. "The music only cares what is in your heart." Marco had music in his heart. He had always had music in his heart. Tonight, finally, he would let it out. The stage lights came up. In the lobby, people were starting to move toward their seats. The biggest night of Marco's life was about to begin. He placed his hands on the keys one more time. In a few moments, the curtain would rise. The audience would see him sitting there in his janitor's uniform. They would be confused. They would wonder what was happening. But then the music would start, and everything would change. The curtain rose slowly. 800 people in expensive clothes looked up at the stage. They expected to see Alessandro Moretti, the famous pianist from Rome. Instead, they saw a man in a blue janitor's uniform sitting at the piano. Confused, whispers spread through the audience like waves. People checked their programs. They looked at each other with puzzled faces. Some thought there had been a mistake. Others wondered if this was some kind of joke. In the front row, the mayor and his wife were whispering to each other. Behind them, music critics from 3 major newspapers were taking notes. They looked confused and slightly annoyed. They had come to review a famous pianist, not some unknown person in work clothes. Mrs. Valentina Rossi, one of the opera house's biggest donors, leaned over to her husband. "What is happening?" she whispered. "Where is Moretti? Who is this man?" Her husband, a wealthy businessman, shook his head. "I have no idea. This better be good. We paid €500 for these seats." In the balcony, tourists from Germany and France were looking through their opera glasses. They had traveled to Milan specifically for this concert. They were taking pictures and looking confused. Signora Benedetti walked to the front of the stage. The audience became quiet, waiting for an explanation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "tonight we have an unexpected change in our program. Alessandro Moretti became ill and cannot perform. However, we are honored to present a very special artist who will play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. Please welcome Marco Santelli." The audience clapped politely, but they still looked confused. Marco Santelli. They had never heard this name before. And why was he wearing a janitor's uniform? Marco looked out at all the faces staring at him. Rich faces. Important faces. Faces that expected perfection. His hands started to shake again. What was he doing here? These people had paid a lot of money. They deserved a real musician, not a janitor who learned piano as a hobby. But then Marco saw something that gave him courage. In the third row, an old woman was smiling at him. She had kind eyes that reminded him of his piano teacher, Mrs. Rosa. The woman nodded at him as if to say, "You can do this." Maestro Giovanni raised his baton. The orchestra became ready. Marco placed his hands on the keys. The entire opera house was silent. Even the confused whispers had stopped. Everyone was waiting. The conductor gave the signal. The orchestra began with the opening chords of the concerto. The music was soft and mysterious. It filled the opera house like morning fog. Marco counted the beats, waiting for his entrance. Then it was time. Marco's hands touched the keys, and the first piano notes rang out. They were gentle but clear, perfect in pitch and timing. The music seemed to float up to the high ceiling and wrap around every person in the audience. As Marco continued to play, something amazing began to happen. The confused looks on people's faces started to change. Their eyes widened with surprise. Their mouths opened slightly. This janitor, this unknown man in work clothes, was playing like an angel. Mrs. Rossi, the wealthy donor, felt tears coming to her eyes. She had heard many pianists over the years. She had attended concerts in Vienna and London and Paris. But there was something special about this music. It was not just technically perfect. It was full of emotion, full of soul. The music critics stopped taking notes about the unusual situation. Instead, they started taking notes about the music itself. This was extraordinary playing. Where had this pianist come from? How had he learned to play with such feeling? Marco's confidence grew as he played. The nervousness was gone now. He was lost in the music. His rough hands, stained from years of cleaning, moved across the keys like they were meant to be there. Each note was a piece of his heart. Each phrase was a story from his life. The orchestra musicians were amazed. They had played this concerto many times with different soloists. But tonight felt different. This unknown pianist was inspiring them to play better than usual. His passion was contagious. The violinists played with more emotion. The horn players put extra soul into their solos. As the music reached the first big climax, the audience was completely transformed. The businessman who had complained about ticket prices was leaning forward in his seat, totally absorbed. The tourists from Germany had forgotten to take pictures. They were just listening, with their eyes closed and smiles on their faces. In the balcony, a young music student named Paolo was crying. He had studied piano for 10 years but had never been able to play with this kind of emotion. Watching Marco made him understand something new about music. It was not just about technique. It was about expressing your heart. The mayor's wife grabbed her husband's arm. "This is incredible," she whispered. "I have never heard anything like this." Even the ushers had stopped their work to listen. They stood at the back of the theater, amazed by what they were hearing. Some of them knew Marco as the quiet janitor who worked at night. They had never imagined he had this gift inside him. As Marco played the beautiful, slow section of the concerto, the entire audience seemed to hold its breath. The music was so delicate, so full of longing. It spoke of dreams that had been put away, of love that had been lost, of hope that still remained. An elderly man in the fifth row was thinking about his late wife. The music reminded him of their first dance at their wedding 50 years ago. Tears rolled down his cheeks, but they were happy tears. Good memories brought back by beautiful music. A young couple on their first date forgot they were trying to impress each other. They just held hands and listened to the magic happening on stage. The music was bringing them closer together without them even realizing it. The music critics were running out of superlatives in their notes. Extraordinary. Magnificent. Once in a lifetime. They would later write that they had witnessed musical history being made. As the concerto moved into its final section, the tempo became faster and more exciting. Marco's fingers flew across the keys in rapid passages that most pianists found difficult. But for Marco, it felt natural. This was the music he had dreamed of playing for 15 years. Every note was a celebration of this moment. The orchestra was playing with incredible energy now. They were feeding off Marco's passion. The entire performance had become something more than just a concert. It was a shared experience between the musicians and the audience. Everyone in the opera house was part of something special. Mrs. Rossi looked around at the faces near her. She saw wonder. She saw joy. She saw people being moved by art in a way that rarely happened. This unknown janitor had reminded them all why music mattered, why beauty mattered, why dreams mattered. As Marco approached the final thunderous ending of the concerto, the entire audience was on the edge of their seats. Rich and poor, young and old, local and tourist. Everyone was united by the power of the music. They had forgotten about social status and expensive clothes. They had forgotten about their daily worries and problems. All that mattered was the music, and the music was perfect. The last notes were coming. The moment that would change everything was almost here. Marco had transformed from a janitor into an artist. The audience had transformed from skeptical strangers into believers, and the best part was still to come. The final notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 rang through the Milano Opera House. Marco played the last powerful chords with all his heart. His hands came down on the keys one final time, and then the music stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. Not a single sound could be heard in the entire theater. 800 people sat perfectly still, as if they were afraid to break the magic spell that had been cast over them. Marco sat at the piano bench, breathing hard. His hands were still on the keys. He could not believe what had just happened. He had actually done it. He had played Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with a full orchestra in front of 800 people, and it had been beautiful. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Marco began to worry. Maybe he had made mistakes. Maybe the audience had not liked his performance. Maybe they were sitting in shocked silence because it had been terrible. Then suddenly it began. One person started clapping, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire opera house exploded in the loudest applause Marco had ever heard. It was like thunder rolling through the building. The sound was so powerful that Marco could feel it in his chest. But that was just the beginning. Mrs. Valentina Rossi was the first person to stand up. She rose from her front row seat with tears streaming down her face, clapping as hard as she could. Her husband quickly joined her. Then the mayor and his wife stood up. Then the music critics. Then the tourists from Germany and France. Like a wave spreading across the ocean, the entire audience rose to their feet. All 800 people were standing and clapping. Some were crying. Some were shouting, "Bravo!" Others were whistling and cheering. Marco stared out at the sea of standing people. He had never seen anything like this. He had never imagined that he could make people feel this way. His mother had been right all those years ago. God had given him a gift. And tonight, finally, he had shared it with the world. The applause went on and on. It seemed like it would never stop. People were clapping so hard their hands hurt, but they could not stop. They had just witnessed something incredible, something that would live in their memories forever. In the orchestra, the musicians were also standing and clapping. They had played with many famous soloists over the years, but tonight had been special. This unknown janitor had inspired them to play better than they had ever played before. Maestro Giovanni walked over to Marco and shook his hand. "That was magnificent," he said, his voice full of emotion. "In 40 years of conducting, I have rarely heard such beautiful playing." Marco stood up from the piano bench. His legs felt weak. He was overwhelmed by the response. The applause was still going strong after 5 minutes. People were shouting his name now. "Marco! Marco! Marco!" Signora Benedetti appeared at Marco's side. She had tears in her eyes. "I cannot believe what just happened," she said. "This is the most amazing thing I have ever seen in this opera house." The young music student, Paolo, was crying in the balcony. He was clapping so hard his hands were red and sore. "I want to play like that someday," he told his friend. "I want to make people feel the way Marco just made me feel." The elderly man who had been thinking about his late wife was standing and applauding with a huge smile on his face. The music had brought him so much joy. It had reminded him that life was beautiful, even after loss. The music critics were already planning their reviews in their heads. They knew they had just witnessed something historic. This was not just a good concert. This was a story that people would tell for years to come. Flowers began appearing on the stage. The opera house staff were bringing bouquets from the lobby, decorations. Soon the stage around Marco was covered with red roses, white lilies, and yellow daisies. The sweet smell of flowers mixed with the warm smell of the theater. The applause continued for 8 full minutes. 8 minutes of pure appreciation and joy. Marco bowed again and again. Each time he bowed, the applause got even louder. People could not get enough of showing their appreciation. Finally, some people in the audience began chanting, "Encore, encore." They wanted Marco to play something else. They did not want this magical evening to end. Marco looked at Maestro Giovanni. The conductor smiled and nodded. "What would you like to play?" he asked. Marco thought for a moment. He wanted to play something that would show his gratitude to the audience, something that would express how he felt about this incredible night. He thought about all the pieces he knew, and then he had an idea. "Chopin's Ballade No. 1, Marco said. "Just piano, no orchestra." Maestro Giovanni nodded and gestured for the orchestra to sit down. The audience gradually became quiet, sensing that something special was about to happen again. Marco sat back down at the piano. He looked out at the faces in the audience. These were no longer strangers who might judge him. These were friends who had shared a beautiful experience with him. These were people who understood that music could transform lives. He began to play Chopin's ballad. The melody was gentle and sad at first, like someone remembering a lost love, but gradually it became stronger and more hopeful. It told the story of someone who had faced difficulties but had never given up on their dreams. As Marco played, many people in the audience felt like he was telling their own story. Everyone had dreams that seemed impossible. Everyone had moments when they felt like giving up. But Marco's music reminded them that miracles could happen, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. When the ballade ended, the applause started again immediately. It was just as loud and enthusiastic as before. People were throwing flowers onto the stage now. Marco was surrounded by more flowers than he had ever seen in one place. He stood up and bowed one final time. The applause seemed to shake the very walls of the opera house. Marco looked up at the ceiling, thinking about his mother. She would have been so proud of this moment. As the curtain finally came down, Marco could still hear the applause through the heavy fabric. It was the sound of appreciation, the sound of joy, the sound of dreams coming true. Behind the curtain, Signora Benedetti hugged Marco tightly. "You have changed everything tonight," she said, "for the opera house, for the audience, for yourself. Nothing will ever be the same." Marco smiled through his tears. She was right. Nothing would ever be the same. He was no longer just Marco the janitor. He was Marco the pianist, Marco the artist, Marco the miracle. And the best part was, this was only the beginning. The next morning, Marco woke up in his small apartment and wondered if it had all been a dream. Had he really played piano at the Milano Opera House? Had 800 people really given him a standing ovation? It seemed too incredible to be true. But then he saw the flowers. His tiny apartment was filled with bouquets that people had given him after the show. Red roses covered his kitchen table. White lilies sat on his windowsill. The sweet smell of flowers filled every room. Marco's phone had been ringing all morning. He had never received so many phone calls in his life. Most of the numbers were ones he did not recognize. When he finally answered one, a woman's excited voice spoke rapidly in English. "Mr. Santelli, this is Sarah Thompson from Classical Music Today magazine in New York. We would love to interview you about your incredible performance last night. The whole classical music world is talking about you." Marco was confused. "How do you know about last night?" he asked. "The video has gone viral," Sarah explained. "Someone recorded your performance and posted it online. It has been viewed over 2 million times already. People all around the world are sharing it." Marco did not understand what "gone viral" meant, but it sounded important. After he hung up, Clara from the opera house called him. "Marco," she said, "you need to see this." She told him to go to the internet cafe down the street and look at the video online. At the internet cafe, Marco watched in amazement as the young man working there showed him the video of his performance. The title read, "Janitor Gives Performance of a Lifetime at Milano Opera House." The comments below were in many different languages, but Marco could understand enough to see that people were saying wonderful things. This made me cry. This is what music is all about. He plays better than most professional pianists. What an inspiration. The young man at the cafe, whose name was Luigi, was excited to meet Marco. "You are famous," he said. "My sister shared this video with all her friends. Everyone in the neighborhood is talking about you." When Marco returned to his apartment, more phone calls were waiting. Record companies wanted to meet with him. Concert halls were inviting him to perform. Newspapers wanted to write stories about him. A man named Stefano Morelli called from Rome. He said he was from EMI Classical, a famous music company. "Mr. Santelli," he said, "we would like to offer you a recording contract. We want to make an album of you playing classical piano pieces." Marco could barely speak. A recording contract? Like the famous pianists he had always admired, it seemed impossible. That afternoon, Signora Benedetti called a meeting at the opera house. When Marco arrived, he found the lobby full of reporters and photographers. They all wanted to talk to him and take his picture. "Marco! Marco!" they shouted. "How does it Feel to become famous overnight? Will you continue working as a janitor? Where did you learn to play so beautifully? Marco felt overwhelmed. Yesterday, nobody had known his name. Today, everyone wanted to talk to him. He answered their questions as best he could, but he still felt like this was all happening to someone else. Inside the opera house, Signora Benedetti had news for him. "Marco," she said, "I want to offer you a position as our featured pianist. You would perform here regularly and help train young musicians. Of course, we would also like you to keep your current job until you feel comfortable making the transition." Marco was touched by her kindness. Many bosses would have been upset that their janitor had hidden such a big secret from them. But Signora Benedetti was happy for his success. "There is something else," she said. "We have received calls from opera houses in Paris, London, and New York. They all want to invite you to perform. The Metropolitan Opera in New York wants you to play next month." The Metropolitan Opera? Marco had heard of it his whole life. It was one of the most famous opera houses in the world, and they wanted him to play there. Over the next few days, Marco's life became a whirlwind of activity. Reporters came to interview him at his apartment. Photographers took pictures of him at the opera house piano. A television crew followed him around for a documentary. Mrs. Rossi, the wealthy donor who had been in the front row, invited Marco to dinner at her mansion. She introduced him to her friends as the most talented musician in Milan. They treated him like a celebrity. The music critics who had been skeptical before his performance now wrote glowing reviews in their newspapers. "Marco Santelli is a natural genius," wrote the critic from Corriere della Sera. "His performance last night reminded us why we fell in love with music in the first place." But perhaps the most meaningful response came from ordinary people. Marco received hundreds of letters and emails from people all around the world. Many of them shared their own stories of hidden dreams and secret talents. A woman from Germany wrote, "Your performance inspired me to start painting again. I had given up art to become an accountant, but watching you made me realize it is never too late to follow your passion." A man from Japan wrote, "I am a bus driver, but I have always wanted to be a singer. Your courage to perform in front of all those people has given me the strength to try out for a local choir." A teenager from Brazil wrote, "I am learning piano, but I felt like I was not good enough. After seeing your video, I understand that music is about feeling, not just technique. Thank you for showing me what is possible." These letters meant more to Marco than all the fame and opportunities. He had not just entertained people for one evening. He had inspired them to believe in themselves and their own dreams. The music school that Marco had always wanted to attend called him. The director said they would be honored to have him come and give a master class to their students. They offered to pay him more money for one afternoon than he used to make in a month as a janitor. Marco's neighbors in his apartment building were excited about his success. Mrs. Antonelli, the old woman who lived next door, had always been kind to him. Now she told everyone that she had always known Marco was special. "He was always so gentle and polite," she said to the reporters. "I could sometimes hear piano music from his apartment late at night, but I thought it was just his radio. I never imagined he was playing it himself." The pastor at Marco's church asked him to play during Sunday service. Marco agreed, and the church was more crowded than it had ever been. People came from all over the city to hear the famous janitor pianist play hymns. But with all the excitement and opportunities, Marco also felt pressure. Everyone expected him to be perfect now. Everyone was watching him. Some people worried that he might not be able to live up to the incredible standard he had set with his first performance. Marco tried not to think about the pressure. He remembered what Mrs. Rosa had taught him. Play from your heart, and the music will always be true. As the week went on, Marco had to make some big decisions. Should he accept the recording contract? Should he move to a bigger apartment now that he could afford it? Should he travel to New York to play at the Metropolitan Opera? Most importantly, what kind of musician did he want to become? He had spent his whole life as an unknown janitor with a secret talent. Now he had the chance to become anything he wanted. The world was waiting to see what Marco Santelli would do next. 6 months later, Marco stood backstage at the Milano Opera House, but everything was different now. Instead of a blue janitor's uniform, he wore an elegant black tailcoat and white bow tie. His rough hands had softened from daily practice instead of daily cleaning. His name was printed on programs and posters all around the city. Tonight was special. It was Marco's first official debut concert as the Opera House's featured pianist. He would be performing the same piece that had changed his life, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. But this time, people were coming specifically to hear him play. All 800 seats were sold out. The tickets had sold so fast that the Opera House could have filled the theater 3 times over. People had traveled from other countries just to hear the famous janitor pianist perform. In his dressing room, Marco looked at himself in the mirror. He looked like a real concert pianist now, but he kept something in his jacket pocket that reminded him of where he came from, his old name tag from his janitor uniform. He carried it with him to every performance as a reminder of his journey. The past 6 months had been like living in a dream. Marco had signed the recording contract with EMI Classical. His first album, Hidden Dreams, had become the best-selling classical album of the year. He had performed at the Metropolitan Opera in New York, where he received a 10-minute standing ovation. He had played at Carnegie Hall, Royal Albert Hall in London, and the Vienna State Opera. But tonight felt most special because he was home. This was where his miracle had begun. This was where he had cleaned floors and dreamed of playing music. Now he was the star of the show. Marco had also started a music scholarship fund for poor children who wanted to learn piano but could not afford lessons. He remembered how hard his mother had worked to pay for his lessons. He wanted to make sure other children would not have to give up their musical dreams because of money. 20 young students were now learning piano for free because of Marco's scholarship. Some of them would be in the audience tonight, sitting in special seats that Marco had reserved for them. There was a knock on his dressing room door. 5 minutes, Maestro Santelli, said the stage manager. Everyone called him Maestro now, a title of respect for accomplished musicians. But Marco still felt like the same person inside. Clara, who was now Marco's assistant manager, peeked into the room. "The audience is ready for you," she said with a smile. "I think half of Milan is out there tonight." Marco nodded and stood up. As he walked toward the stage, he passed the supply closet where he used to keep his mop and bucket. Giuseppe, his old friend who worked with the lights, was there to wish him luck. "Look at you now," Giuseppe said with tears in his eyes. "From cleaning this place to owning it." "I do not own it," Marco laughed. "I just get to play music here." "Same thing," Giuseppe said. "Music owns this place and you are the music." As Marco walked onto the stage, he was amazed by what he saw. The entire audience was already on their feet, clapping before he had even played a note. In the front row, he saw familiar faces. Mrs. Rossi was there, beaming with pride. The mayor and his wife were back. Even some of the music critics who had been skeptical 6 months ago were applauding enthusiastically. But the most special guests were in the third row. 20 children from his music scholarship program sat with their parents. Their eyes were wide with excitement. Some of them had never been to an opera house before. They were living proof that dreams could come true. Marco also noticed that some of his old colleagues were in the audience. Anna, who sewed costumes, had a seat in the balcony. Roberto, who moved heavy equipment, was there with his family. They had watched their quiet colleague transform into an international star, and they could not have been prouder. The orchestra members took their positions. Maestro Giovanni was conducting again, just like that magical night 6 months ago. He gave Marco a warm smile and a nod. As Marco sat at the piano bench, he felt completely different than he had 6 months ago. Then, he had been terrified and uncertain. Now he felt confident and ready. But the most important thing had not changed: his love for the music. The audience became quiet. Marco placed his hands on the keys and felt the familiar coolness of the ivory. He thought about his mother, who he knew was watching from heaven. He thought about Mrs. Rosa, his first piano teacher, who had believed in him when he was just a small boy. He thought about all the people around the world who had written to tell him that his story had inspired them to pursue their own dreams. Most of all, He thought about the power of music to change lives. His life had been changed by music. The lives of everyone in the audience had been touched by music. Music had the power to bring people together, to make them feel less alone, to remind them that beautiful things were possible. Maestro Giovanni raised his baton. The orchestra was ready. Marco was ready. The audience was ready. The music began. As the opening chords filled the opera house, Marco smiled. This was exactly where he belonged. Not because he was wearing fancy clothes, or because people were paying to hear him play. He belonged here because music lived in his heart, and this was a place where music could be shared. The piano's voice joined the orchestra, and once again, the Milano Opera House was filled with magic. But this time it was not a surprise. This time it was the beginning of a new chapter in Marco's life, a chapter where dreams had come true, and music had found its rightful home. As Marco played the beautiful, familiar notes of Rachmaninoff's concerto, he realized something important. He had not just become a famous musician. He had become proof that extraordinary things could happen to ordinary people. He had become hope for everyone who had ever felt invisible or forgotten. The janitor, who had once cleaned this stage, was now commanding it. The man who had once hidden his talent was now sharing it with the world. The dreamer who had thought his chance had passed had discovered that it is never too late for dreams to come true. And in the audience, 20 young music students watched and learned that with passion, hard work, and a little bit of courage, any dream was possible. The music soared through the opera house, carrying with it all the hope and beauty that Marco had kept hidden for so many years. Now it was free, and it would inspire people for generations to come. Marco Santelli had found his voice, and the world was listening.